take a look at where we are with the sign-up form. Remember, we actually do have a test for this. This is in the user's controller and user's controller spec. And so we've got this section here for get new, right in here. Now, we're actually not going to add any tests in this section. What we're going to do is put in the form, and then we're going to test how the form responds to these GET requests, and then we'll see what happens when we post to the create action of the user's controller. But we will be testing all of the things that go on in this section at the end of this lesson when we write integration tests. Let's take a look at a mock-up of the sign-up form that we're going to be making. We've actually looked at this briefly once before. Here's the kind of sign-up form we're going to be looking for. Very simple, just sign up, name, email, password, and then a password confirmation field, and then a sign up button, of course, together with the site layout that we're going to get for free because of the application.html.erb file that we've created. All right, let's get started with this form. The form, as you can probably guess, will live in the new.html.erb file for the under users. Let's take a look at this. This is an app views users new.html.erb. Of course, right now it's just this stub, but we'll fix that right now. All right, we're going to be using a Rails helper called form4 that creates a form for a particular kind of object. In this case, that object will be a user. So let me just show you that Autotest is currently running. Actually, I've changed my tabs up a bit. We're going to put a console here in the second tab. So this tab is going to have Autotest. Actually, it does have Autotest. Let's take a look at it. And we are green. And the reason I showed you that is because we're about to go red. I just want to show you how that works. So in this file, let's take a look. Actually, we want this H1. Let's say sign up. And now we're going to say form4. Now, the way this is embedded Ruby, form_4, and then we're going to require that there be an @user instance variable. Do, and then F for form. This is like in the migration. Let's take a look at that. This is a common convention. DB migrate. So we saw in the create users migration do T. This is for table. Create table users do T for table. Now we're doing do F for form. And it's good policy, I think, always to put the end that's required. So the end does not have the %equals, but the form4 does. Now this is a change in Rails 3. If you've used Rails before, you might be used to omitting this equals for the form4. But in Rails 3, you have the %equals here. And then the end is just like this. So this is embedded Ruby with a block, do, F, end. And now inside this, we're going to put the code needed to make the actual form. So let me just put in the first field, and then we'll see where we are with our tests. So I'm going to put in a div tag of class field. And inside here, I'm going to put some embedded Ruby. I'm going to put in a label, and it's going to be called on the F object, so f.label. And then I'm going to say this is a label for the name attribute. I'm going to be going through the attributes in the user model. So actually, let's take a look at that. Here's the user model. So we've got name. So which of these attributes are we going to want to have in the sign-up form? Well, name, email, and then we'll have a password and a password confirmation field that, through the machinery we built in the last lesson, will ultimately be saved as the encrypted password. So let's take a look at this here. This is just a label. This is just raw HTML, or it's going to generate raw HTML. Label is one of the HTML tags that you can put inside a form. And now we're going to have a text field, f.text field. And that's also going to be for the name. And I'm going to put a break right here. So let's take a look at what this did. Okay, so we're now red. And the reason we're red is because there are a bunch of places that hit the new page. Let's just scroll up and see one of them. Right, there's a place, sign up now, undefined method model name nil for nil class. That's because this guy is nil, right? Remember, when instance variables aren't defined, they're just nil. And we don't have an @user variable in the new action here. So let's add in an @user and see how that changes things. So this is a new user. So we're just going to say @user equals, let's put it in a space here, user.new. Now we're not going to pass in an options hash because what we're doing is initializing a new user, and in the create action we'll actually use the params hash to instantiate a new user that has the attributes corresponding to the attribute submitted in the form. But for now we just want a raw user object. So let's save this. So those are just the user's controller specs. Now let's just rerun the whole test suite, make sure we're green, and we are. So now let's take a look at the form. Of course, we're going to build this up. There's a lot more than just the name. We saw in the mock-up all the things we needed, but let's take a look at this and see how we're doing. Okay, we've got the sign up h1, and then this is what gets generated by that label, f.label name, f.textfield name. If you're wondering how this works, how does this f variable get defined? How does this embedded Ruby know to make this name field? I don't know those things. This is part of what Rails does for you. What I know is that if you do f.label name, what you end up with is an actual label with the word name, and then there's a text field for the name. So let's take a look at the source. This is how you learn what embedded Ruby does is and especially what embedded Ruby does with respect to these Rails helpers is you look at the helpers, you look at the code, and then you take a look at the actual HTML generated. So you can take a look at comparing these two. In fact, why don't I just do this here? Just copy these guys. So I'm going to copy this in so we can see what's being generated by this. Of course, I'll get rid of this in a moment. So what this form for does, form for @user, well, because this is a user object, Rails knows that what we want to do is have this be a class new user, and it also gives it an ID new user. And the reason it knows that it's a new user is that it can tell that in fact that the user is not a current record. You may recall that in the last lesson we had this line, self.salt equals make salt if new record. That means that you can always find out if an active record object corresponds to a new record or one that already exists. That's also how Rails knows that this is a post. Remember, it's post by default for a form. We'll see later on in this tutorial that when it's an existing object, the method will be post formally, but then there will be some trickery to make it into a put, which is what you need to update a user. So this form for line right here gives us action to /users, and then a class and ID that we don't really have to worry about right now, and then some styling stuff that you really should ignore. I mean, really ignore that. I don't even know what it's doing there either. And then there's some trickery here. This is what's called an authenticity token, and with this crazy value. This is some machinery that Rails puts in automatically to prevent what's called a forgery attack. Again, you don't really need to worry about how this works. I don't know how it works, but you can be confident that the people who make Rails are worrying about this for you. And then we get to the stuff that's generated by this class equals field, the div class equals field, and the f.label. So here's div class equals field, label for username, and what Rails is doing here is it knows this is a user object, and we tell it it's for the name attribute. And so it constructs automatically this user underscore name here, and then the name is user, and then square brackets. You do not need to worry about how it is that Rails does all this. This is just the code that comes out of this embedded Ruby, and we'll see once we start making the create action how to handle the result of submitting this form. But this is just a look at under the hood, so to speak, to see the kind of code that Rails is generating in order to perform the submission and in order to create a new user. So I'm just going to leave this in here briefly, and we'll fill out the rest of this form. Let's just do this. So I'm just going to copy this because we're mainly going to be doing the same thing here. There's going to be a little bit of trickery later on, but this is pretty straightforward at this point. So f.label name, we want email. This is email. Then we want password. Remember that the name and the email addresses are columns in the database. right? They correspond to columns in the database, as we can see here from the annotation. Whereas password is this virtual attribute that is created by the @accessor keyword here at the top. So even though these things are really quite different in the way they're implemented, in terms of the interface, they're exactly the same. You can just treat them the same way in these form labels and text fields. And so now that we've got this password, we also want the password confirmation. And so let's do this. This is password confirmation. This is also the same. And remember how this password confirmation field comes around. There is no @accessor for it. There's no column in the database. It gets created automatically when we say confirmation true for the password validation. And so that sort of synthesized attribute can also be treated in this unified way with just f.label, then a symbol, f.textfield, then a symbol. And this last thing at the bottom, we're going to give this a different class. We're going to say this is class equals actions. You can use any name you want for these. This is not part of Rails, these labels or these classes. But then we do want to put a submit button. So this is how you do a submit button. And then we're going to say sign up. Let's get rid of this. Let's take a look at what this did for us. So this looks pretty good. There is one thing I'd like to change, though. This password confirmation it's a little verbose, it's a little redundant, because password confirmation, you don't need to say password twice. And it's also useful to know how to switch this label up in case you want to override the default. So by default, what it's doing is it knows about the symbol, right? It says password _ confirmation, and it converts that to capital P password and then lowercase confirmation. We just want to say confirmation. So you can give it an optional second argument, which is the string corresponding to the label. So I'm just going to say confirmation. You can see how this works. Let's take another look at the source, just to see how it all fits together. So it's this stuff in here. Let's just look at the inner stuff here. So you can see the correspondence here. We've got this div class equals field. That's just HTML. So that's what we've got down here. Div class equals field, div class equals field. And then there's a structure to this. There's user _ name, user _ email, user _ password, and so on. Now, at this point, if you have much experience with HTML, you might be a little uncomfortable with the field type that we're using here for the password and password confirmation. You can see that we've got input fields type equals text, which is the same thing we have for the email and name fields. And that comes from using f.textfield here. But these are not the right kinds of input fields for passwords. And let's take a look at why that is. So here's our web form. And say we fill out the email address. So when we type michael@example.com, the web form displays what we type. But let's take a look at what we have for password and password confirmation right now. So here I've typed foobar, and ordinarily on the web, there's a convention of obscuring this password because right now, with the password just showing up, anybody who walks by can just glance up at the screen and see what the password is. So in order to get that password obscuring to work, we need to use a different type of input field called password. So instead of type equals text, we're going to have type equals password for here and down here. So let's get rid of this. The way to do that is simply to change text field to password field. And actually, we don't want to do this. We want to change this one. So this is f.password field, and then f.password field here. And let's reload this page. And now if I type in the password foobar, it obscures it just the way we expect it to, in this case with these bold dots. And if we look at the source, we can see here that it says type equals password for the input field. And before moving on, I'd like to add just a little bit of custom CSS. I'm just going to add a little bit of CSS for the divs here. Div dot, what is it called again? We've got field and action, so both of them will get a little bit of a margin. So you can see we can put two things here in one line in CSS. And let's give it margin 10 pixels. Let's see what that does. Well, looks a little bit nicer. All right, so let's make a commit. Actually, let's just double check. It's always a good policy. Good. Let's get status. Git commit -am, and we're going to say added a sign-up form. It's not working yet, but it's there.